Policy Beats with me, Hamzah Rifaat. In today's episode, we're going to be speaking about the state of the Pakistan economy. Now, we all know that fiscal and monetary policies have a trickle-down effect on the population of the country. What sort of policies are actually devised in the federal capital, which is in Islamabad, has a bearing on every single individual within the geographical confines of the country. To discuss the kind of policies that are actually being implemented in the country, along with what sort of an economic policy is Pakistan actually implementing at this point in time, I'm joined by the Vice Chancellor of the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, Dr. Nadeem Haque, who's also served in the IMF for 24 years, and he was also the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of the country. Dr. Nadeem Haque, thank you so much for joining me on Policy Beats.
All right, Dr. Nadeem, my first question is a very simple one. The tax revenues in the first half of the fiscal year have not necessarily been as significant as what has actually been expected. Do you think this is going to have a significant impact on the economic policy of Pakistan and the government's dedicated efforts towards development?
Quite frankly, given the COVID situation, tax revenues should have been lower than they were, in fact. Given the COVID situation, the economy has slowed down dramatically. So the tax revenue should have slowed down too. So it should not be an expectation. In any case, I don't think tax revenues constrain any economy from growing. Tax revenues are only meant to do one thing: finance government operations, right? The rest of the economy does not depend on government operations. It does in one sense if the operations are efficient and well used. If the operations are well used, policies well made, economy runs, the government runs well, the economy takes off. But in our case, over the last 30 years or 40 years, maybe even more probably, for the last 70 years, we've had an IMF program every few years. We have used the IMF more often than other countries. We are in the emergency ward of the IMF. It seems we make no policy, we just go to the IMF, simple. And we rely on donors for making our policies. So quite frankly, to say tax revenue constrains us is not unacceptable to me at all. Secondly, we lose more money through the public sector enterprise losses than we even care to count. We lose roughly half our revenues through public sector enterprise losses. So the story that Pakistan media seems to have swallowed, and Pakistan intellectuals seems to have swallowed, that somehow tax revenues is a problem, has to be revisited, has to be rethought. Tax revenues are not a problem. The problem is bad policy, bad governance, and that is not today, that is not this government. That is something that has plagued us through most of our history.
Now, it has been reported that provincial tax revenues have actually increased more than maybe the federal tax revenues. I mean, this is a trend which has been seen as far as the previous year is concerned. Do you think this is going to result in greater divides between the federal government and the provincial governments on subjects such as the 18th Amendment?
Again, the 18th Amendment is the political settlement, which means that the provinces should have some autonomy. It's been a settlement that took about 50 years to make. Because remember, it was envisaged in the 1973 Constitution, but even before that, it was envisaged in the earlier constitutions too. We've always had a problem in terms of defining center-province relationships. And our politicians, whoever, our discourse has been that there should be provincial autonomy. But I would go further. Our discourse now is we should have local autonomy in the sense that we should have local government. But unfortunately, our discourse remains kind of always stuck because we have no intellectual depth in the country. People think that the taxation is the major problem. That's where the problem begins, because we seem to think taxes. We don't seem to think economy. We don't seem to think growth. We don't seem to think employment. We don't seem to think welfare. We think everything is taxes, which is a very bizarre way of looking at things. Only in Pakistan do we think that. In the US, when they want to grow, they lower taxes. When we want to grow, we increase taxes. So we have got a bizarre relationship with taxation. And I submit that comes because of a lack of knowledge and thought. Again, as the provincial revenues have increased, okay, fine, they might have increased. I'm not sure, I have no information. But if the provincial revenues have increased, that's good. Again, why should the federation look to the province for taxes? If we've got autonomy, then everybody has their own domain, they should work autonomously. Again, the problem is when the federation is incapable of doing its work. For example, the provinces don't tell the federation to make losses in the public sector enterprises. Why do we make losses in the public sector enterprises? These losses have not happened today. They've been happening for the last 20 years. Now, 20 years is a long time to fix any problem. So they can't fix that problem and they want to go to the provinces to give us more revenues, which I find not acceptable. Again, there should be greater clarity on what each level of government can do. And even the provinces should now devolve power down to the local governments. Local governments have been talked about for at least 30, 40 years now. It's time we had them.
All right. So, sir, based on another report that I would like to quote is the fact that 70% of fiscal revenues have been used for debt servicing as well. As far as this government is concerned, do you think that this puts the government in a very difficult situation as to whether or not they are supposed to really focus on subjects such as debt servicing as compared to maybe economic development?
Look, debt servicing, our ancestors, our religion, everything tells us that debt is not a good thing to do. I, as an individual, don't like to carry debt. I'm sure you, as an individual, don't like to carry debt.
Absolutely not.
Anybody who lives on credit cards obviously makes a fool of himself eventually. Now, the point is, debt policy is also in the government's hands. And they must make sure that they have a good debt policy that is capable of creating long-run growth, long-run opportunity in the country. We tend to create debt without creating opportunity and growth. And then we sit there and say, oh my God, debt service is high. Of course it's high. Of course it's high. But that's a result of the past mistakes that we made. It's time to stop creating debt, start creating opportunity, start creating growth, and then you move forward. But the government, each government, not this government, every government does not want to create opportunity and growth. They want to tax more, scare people to death so that they don't invest anything and then get more debt. Now, that's a cycle out of which you can't grow. If you want to not earn anything and want to use your credit card, and then you want to tell me, oh my God, look, my credit card payments are so high. What am I going to tell you? I'm going to tell you, you're a bloody fool. I have no sympathy for you. Simple.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's almost as if this policy of debt servicing has a lot of continuity as far as, different governments are concerned. Do you think this government has been different as far as debt servicing is concerned, or, as far as you could say increasing sovereign debt is concerned?
Debt is a byproduct of the way you live. You don't acquire debt. I use my credit card because I want to live high. Why? Because I might want to gamble, or I might want to go and live in 7-star hotels, or might want to enjoy lovely party. If I want that kind of a lifestyle, my debt service is going to be high, right? So if you're going to come and tell me, your debt service is high, I would say you're not a good analyst. The problem is that my spending habits are terrible. My spending habits are way higher than it. That's why I keep pointing to the public sector enterprise losses. That's why I keep pointing to the bad policy that scares investment. That's why I keep pointing to the fact that we don't have a growth policy. For the last 30 years, we have had no growth policy, or even 40 years. Ever since we killed the Planning Commission, there is no growth policy in the country. Even today, there is no growth policy in the country. And nobody wants to make a growth policy. Nobody wants to make an investment policy. So we are sitting there only thinking about growth and debt and taxation. And analysts around the country, like you, etc., talking about debt and taxes. Debt and taxes are a byproduct of other things. I think we need to focus on as an individual. I need to focus on my income. I need to focus on how I can grow. If I'm not growing, by definition, I'm going to get debt. So the key question to ask is, why are we not growing? And this is a question you must ask of every policymaker, not just this government, previous government, every government, new government that's coming in, everybody. No government, I'm telling you, has had a growth policy in the last 40 years that I can remember.
Right.
No plan has been approved. No plan has been implemented. Plan is our growth policy. There has been none. And nobody wants to adopt it. And even when they adopt it, they do not want to discuss or implement or talk about it. So technically speaking, we are a country without a growth policy. Let's face it, we are a country without a growth policy. We are a country that's searching to solve our debt problem without having a growth policy. We are trying to search a tax, to develop a tax or solve our tax problem without a growth policy. That is undoable.
As far as sovereign debt during the PTI government is concerned, has it increased or decreased?
has to increase. By definition, it has to increase. The economy slowed down last year. Obviously, the debt has to increase. Debt will increase. And you cannot eradicate debt, as I said. The only way to eradicate debt, we've made calculation on this. If you do a 7 to 8% growth every year in the coming years, then you will lower your debt to GDP ratio. But if your growth rate remains at 1 or 2%, then by definition, debt will go. It's simple. If my income is $100 and my expenditure is $120, by definition, my debt has to grow. So the question you have to ask me is, hey, my friend, why don't you take another job? Why don't you go and work somewhere else in the evening? Why don't you do work somewhere else on the weekend, so that your income can be $150, so that you can save $30 and reduce your debt. That's the way to go.
So let's come to the pandemic economy. Now, the pandemic has ravaged countries all across the world. Pakistan has been no exception. The fact remains that, a lot of people, a lot of analysts have considered that Pakistan has managed this pandemic significantly better as compared to maybe some of the other countries. But the impact on the economy has been quite pernicious. Now, it also mandates or requires an extremely important health budget as well. Do you think that Pakistan has significantly invested in the health budget as far as the pandemic is concerned?
Again, I don't see what the health budget. I think we think too often. We are not a socialist economy. We are not a communist economy. We are a free enterprise economy. So everything is not the government's budget, right? But the pandemic, we've been lucky. It hasn't affected us as badly as other countries. Let's face it, we have been lucky. And I don't know what the factors are for our luck, but we have been lucky. We haven't had as many deaths. We haven't as many people affected. Fair enough. Now the question is, where do we go from here? Yes, the global economy has slowed down. We have still been lucky. Our economy has not slowed down as much as it should have. But again, it doesn't mean as if we are on a great path. As I told you, our required growth rate is 7 to 8%. If you tell me 2, 3, 4% GDP on a population that's very young, I'm sorry, I'm not impressed. And nobody's impressed, because you're going to go nowhere with that. For the last 30, 40 years that we've studied the data, our long-run growth is coming down. We used to grow at 4, 5, 6% at one point. Now we are growing at 2, 3%. So that long-run growth is coming down. Our productivity is coming down. Our investment rate has never gone above 15%. If I was the government, I'd be worried about our investment rate. Why is the investment rate is not 30%? India is 30%, China is 40%. If you have to grow, our investment rate has to grow much more. Now the question is, these are the policies we should be talking about. Instead, every day I hear this tax to GDP ratio and debt. Debt policy, debt and tax to GDP ratio are the wrong things to look at. We want to look at investment and growth and employment, and that's what we are not looking at.
Right. Now, sir, my final question is with regard to the cost of corruption. I mean, corruption is a significant problem all across the world, and Pakistan is, no stranger to it. Now, the cost of corruption has a huge impact as far as economic development and GDP growth, and you could say transparency is concerned. How significant is this variable as far as the Pakistan economy is concerned at this present day and age?
It's a bogeyman, totally insignificant. We love to chase the wrong coast. It's the opium of the masses. It's a drama to tell the masses that we are doing something.
Right.
Corruption exists in every country in the world. There is no country that is not corruption-free. That is corruption-free. The US has a huge amount of corruption. What is lobbying? What is campaign finance? All these things are basically corruption. The UK harbors more black money than any other country in the world. Where do you think Nawaz Sharif, etc., have their properties?
Absolutely.
Where do you think all the black money of the world goes, right? Switzerland has always had black money. So for God's sakes, the UAE has a lot of black money. To sing this mantra of corruption is really just trying to, it's just empty talk. You cannot get rid of corruption. Corruption only happens when you have bad institutions, bad governance, bad policies. You're facilitating corruption through your policies. to not focus on your policies, to not focus on your institutions and focus on corruption. Basically, all you're saying is, I want to keep the status quo and I want to try and chase corruption. Fair enough. But the corruption arises out of the status quo. The status quo, even if there is no corruption, the status quo does not want you and me to do anything. For example, we know for a fact, Pakistan is a permission SRO economy. Sorry, permission SRO NOC economy.
NOC.
Corruption doesn't take as much money as the permissions SROs and NOCs. Everything that you want to do requires, we've calculated 50 to 60 permissions or NOCs, right? That takes a month of Sundays, maybe 2 or 3 years to start a project because you have to do with so many permissions NOCs. A little shop that's sitting there has to deal with 10,000 people who come to them. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but not by much. Large number of people who come to them and say, hey, show me this paper, show me this paper, show me this document, do this, do that. The tax authorities want everybody to be tax collectors. If you are a tax collector, you have to spend a lot of time collecting taxes. So the banks collect taxes from you and me, schools collect taxes from you and me, mobile companies collect taxes
Also
from you and
income
me.
tax as well. Yeah.
Right? But if they're collecting those taxes, they are wasting a lot of time. We are wasting a lot of time. Time is gold. Time is money. That's what we do. So corruption is not the problem. The problem is deregulation. The problem is letting people work. The problem is not thinking about people being corrupt, but having some trust in your people. What we've done is we have painted our own people into corrupt, tax cheating people. What should FATF do? What should other people do? They say, hey, you call yourself corrupt. Are we more corrupt than Bangladesh? Are we more corrupt than India? Are we more corrupt than Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia? No, we are not. Rank, everything is there. We can check. But unfortunately, we love to call ourselves corrupt. Why? Because you want to maintain the status quo and not change it. We are not corrupt. We are unproductive, indisciplined, and lack a work culture, and lack the opportunity to work. Whenever somebody starts to work, there are 10 people who are willing to pull his leg. In that economy, you can't make progress. So get off the corruption mantra and start working on the economy.